Hello, Washington Realtors. I'm Jeff Smart, your Washington Realtors president for 2024. And with me today is Annie Fitzsimmons, your legal hotline attorney.
Thanks for letting me be here with you today. A few minutes ago, Jeff, you described to me a phenomenon that your buyer brokers are experiencing that they have not experienced too much in the past.
Right. And
what is that?
And this all comes along with some of the change in our operation, and that's with the Buyer Brokerage Agreement. Well, at the outset of an agency relationship, we are instructed, at least the buyer's agents are instructed to have a conversation with their buyers regarding the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. Okay. And when you get to the point of talking about compensation, talking about the value that you bring as a buyer's agent to this transaction, the buyer may, and in some cases already are, asking for some of that compensation to be directed to them to help pay for their closing costs, down payment, or other costs associated with the transaction of real estate.
Okay. Point in the past. Are you saying that it's just happening more now?
It's happening more now, and I think it's because we talk about compensation up front more now.
Okay. So how does that play out then in the field? How are you seeing brokers handle that? Is it okay? First of all, is it okay for a buyer broker to share compensation with a buyer? Can that happen? Can a buyer broker give part of their compensation to the buyer at closing to offset the buyer's costs at closing?
Well, it seems odd that the legal hotline attorney is asking me that question, but
maybe
yes,
I was setting you up.
I think maybe you were, but yes, a buyer's agent, a buyer's broker can contribute some funds as long as it's approved by their lender to the buyer's closing costs and loan fees and whatnot.
That's right. And the reason I teed up the question that way is because I get that question on the hotline a lot. Buyer wants, and honestly, this is something that historically a question I've gotten, not just since 2024 began, but historically, buyers have asked brokers to share a portion of their compensation. And a lot of brokers, oftentimes coming from other states, they view that as something that they refer to as a rebate, and they have learned in past experience that a buyer broker cannot share any of their compensation with a buyer. And that's simply not a true statement in Washington. In Washington state, any broker can give any or all of their compensation to either of the parties in the transaction, so to the buyer or the seller. You're, of course, exactly right. That buyer can't do anything with somebody else's, with a third party's money, without lender's approval.
Correct.
So how are your brokers, or as the designated broker for your firm, what are your thoughts on buyer brokers approaching this conversation?
Well, it's difficult because as a buyer broker, and I put myself in their shoes, you want to be able to serve that client. You want to be able to put them into a home because that's the goal of your occupation. Right. That's your job. But your job is also to make money and put bread on the table. And right. So by the buyer asking for part of your compensation, well, now you're making less. Now, are you okay with making less? Do you want to try and make more from the seller by asking for more compensation during the contract phase? Or do you just flat out not want to work with that client? Because that can happen too. If a client has asked for that part of that compensation, I know some agents have decided not to work with that client.
So I hear you saying this is all part of the negotiation.
It is.
So when buyer says to buyer broker, so let's put some numbers out there. Let's say that a buyer broker believes that their services as a buyer broker are worth, let's say, 5 apples.
Right. They've placed their value that they're bringing to the table at 5 apples.
Right. When I provide services to a buyer, I want to be paid 5 apples, right? Okay. And so buyer says, great, you should be paid 5 apples, but I want one of those apples credited to me at closing. So then you're saying the buyer broker can either say, okay, we'll keep the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement compensation provision at 5 apples, and I will agree to give one of those apples to you. Or buyer broker can say, no, I'm not working with you. Or Correct. What's the third alternative?
Well, they would request more apples from the seller.
Okay. And they can only request the number of apples or the amount of compensation that is identified on the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement.
Correct.
So if we have a buyer who's telling the buyer broker, I want you to ask the seller to pay 6 apples of compensation and give one of those apples to me, then I'm teeing you up again. But the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, paragraph 5, has to say that the buyer owes the buyer broker how many apples?
It's going to have to be 6.
It's going to have to be 6 apples. And then I would recommend that in the other section of the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, buyer and buyer broker agree that buyer broker will contribute 1 apple to buyer's credit at closing.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So then we set up so then the contract reflects the actual agreement of the parties. Buyer broker, you're actually going to receive 5 apples compensation at closing, but with the BBSA saying that you're entitled to 6, that empowers the buyer broker to negotiate with seller for payment of 6 apples compensation. And then the BBSA already says that buyer brokerage firm has an obligation to share 1 apple compensation with the buyer.
But it gets a little tricky too if seller is not offering that much, or if seller is offering 0, because the BBSA is an agreement that the buyer will compensate the buyer brokerage that many apples.
That's a true statement. So let's set up this scenario. Let's use bigger numbers. Let's say that my value as a buyer broker is 5 apples. I want to be paid 5 apples. And buyer says, I want more than 1 apple. Whatever 1 apple is worth, I want more. I want 3 apples worth. And as the buyer broker, I'm comfortable that I have a reasonable shot at negotiating a seller's payment of 5 apples compensation. But what you're saying is that if I then make the BBSA for 8 apples compensation with having to pay buyer 3 at closing, then you're saying what happens if the seller won't pay 8 apples compensation? Is that right?
Exactly. And what if the agreement, the BBSA, states 6 apples and 3 apples going back to the buyer, and the seller is only offering 3 apples.
So now we have a contract that says that I, as the buyer broker, am going to pay 3 apples. I'm going to credit 3 apples to the buyer at closing, but the buyer and I have been unable to negotiate with the seller to pay a sufficient number of apples to compensate me for my value, plus pay to the buyer the offset that the buyer wants. And of course, we're talking about this in this term. We could also advise the buyer, look, buyer, you can also just ask the seller to pay your closing costs, right? You could use a Form 22A, paragraph 3, ask the seller. But for whatever reason, you're seeing buyers wanting to negotiate
The compensation.
credit from the compensation.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
And so obviously on this video, we're not telling buyer brokers how much they should collect or whether they should be willing to negotiate to reduce the compensation that they think that they are worth to a buyer. I think what I hear you saying is be prepared for this conversation.
Yes. Be very much prepared for this conversation because this is happening. And it's happening because we're talking about it right up front, which we should be doing. We should talk about how the transaction of real estate happens and educate the buyers as we educate the sellers, as we have forever. Now it's time to educate the buyers.
That's right.
And these are conversations that are happening every day. I hear about them in my firm. And so it's a negotiation. And that's usually what I tell my agents is this is a negotiation.
Yeah. So buyer brokers, there is no right or wrong answer to any of these issues, but I do appreciate you bringing some real world experience of what buyer brokers are hearing from buyers in the field right now. Because it's not enough. The question I've gotten on the hotline along these lines is, buyer owes me 5 apples. That's what the BBSA says is 5 apples. But now they're asking me to put 6 apples into paragraph 17B so that I can give them 1 apple. at closing. Or maybe seller has offered 6 apples, so we just want to take those 6 apples.
I hear that too.
Can that happen?
No,
Why not?
because your buyer brokerage services agreement states that your value is 5 apples. You can't take more. You can take less. You can't take more.
Yep.
So if it's gonna go that route, you need to amend your buyer brokerage services agreement.
Right. So in that specific set of facts, buyer broker, before you write the offer for buyer claiming 6 apples of compensation in paragraph 17B, you have to first amend your buyer brokerage services agreement to state that you will be paid 6 apples compensation and to also state that you will share 1 apple of compensation with the buyer at closing.
And I think we have a form for that too.
Form 41A is our buyer brokerage services agreement amendment form. Anything else?
I think we're great.
If you have questions on this topic or any other, please submit a question to the legal hotline at warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.